Today I will paint a mountain lake using watercolor. I'm going to start off with the sky, and what I'm doing is just adding clear water and kind of drawing in where I want the top of my mountain to be with the water first. And then after I fill the entire sky with water, I can start dropping in some sky color. So I'm just kind of getting my sky wet. I'm using 140-pound Arches cold press watercolor paper. And now that it's wet, I can just kind of drop in the cerulean blue color in my sky. And you can kind of move the paper around like this to kind of help spread the paint. I like to try to avoid over brushing. So I kind of put some color on, maybe brush it around a little bit, but I don't want it to all be so perfectly even and smooth. It's kind of nice to have sections of light and dark in the sky. It just makes for a more painterly look. So as I add the color into the sky of this 5x7 piece of paper, I'm just trying to kind of add color here and there, but not over brush it. I might pop in a little bit of ultramarine blue in the corners. I like to make them a tiny bit darker just to kind of keep the viewer's eye in the painting. Next, I'm going to kind of add in where I want the lake to be. So I'm going to kind of add this area down here towards the middle of my painting. And I'm going to have a part of the lake under the mountain here. And then I'm also going to have some underneath this little island area where I'm going to have some trees. So I'm going to go ahead and add in some blues right away at the top to kind of reflect the sky. But as we get closer to the bottom, I'm going to try to indicate maybe some other colors going on in the water. So I'll add a little bit of green right now because there will be some trees reflected. And then I'm even going to add some brown because I want some of the water to be more transparent so we can see some of the dirt or the rock that's showing up under the water. So maybe adding a little bit of brown, a little bit of black towards the bottom of my painting here could be a good idea. And then I'm leaving space for some rocks way on the bottom left. It's kind of a nice way to frame in the painting. It makes the composition a little bit more interesting. So I've got some rocks here on the left that are kind of framing in my painting. The right corner, however, will be filled with water. So I'm adding just kind of some different colors to make my water more interesting. They're getting less of the sky reflection and more visibility where you can kind of see some of the rock and the sand that's under the water. And I'm trying to kind of work with the water while it's wet so that I don't have any strong brush strokes, strong lines. So as long as this area is wet, all of my colors will be kind of a smooth transition from one to the other. You can see inside of my water area, there are no harsh lines right now because it's all wet. As I add other colors into this wet area, the lines are pretty smooth, so you won't get any sharp, strong edges. And that's what I'm looking for right now as I put this first layer on in my painting. I'm adding a little bit more green as a reflection because there will be some trees kind of up in here. I'm adding a little bit more blue. I can kind of darken it a little bit. You can see I'm getting a little streaky now with my brush strokes to kind of show maybe some ripples or some excitement in the water. Again, all while this is wet because I don't want anything too harsh or strong yet. That will come with layers that I add later on in my painting. So I'm just kind of playing around. I'm using horizontal brush strokes. You can kind of lift some color out too by drawing your brush and taking it back and forth. If you get a little dark in areas, it's really easy to pull some water out at this point. And then you can kind of just play around with adding different colors into the reflections of the water. I'm going to get a little darker now and kind of add a little bit of water around these rocks. If my blue is too bright, I can always add a little bit of black or brown to tone it down a little bit so it's not quite so bright. And I do want it to be kind of dark. There's kind of a shadow that's going on behind these rocks here, so I definitely want kind of a shadow to be happening. And I'm actually going to paint the shadow side of the rocks right now because it's okay if it blends right into the water below it. It'll kind of help with the whole reflection thing. So I'm just kind of adding some dark areas on my rocks while the water's wet, because then they can kind of just transition right down into the water's reflection. And because my light is coming from far away, the rocks kind of have this darker area closest to me and maybe a little bit on the right as well. And that way I have this kind of nice effect. I'm also adding just a little bit of texture by kind of turning my brush on its side. That gives it a lot more of a rough brush stroke and can give me some nice rock texture. So I paint the shadows here first, and then I kind of turn my brush on its side a little bit more, and you can kind of almost like scrape the side of the brush to get this nice rough texture in the rocks. So that'll be kind of nice, like rough shadow excitement going on there. I'm going to add a little bit more dark while my water's still wet here. Just a little bit more shadow. I will definitely add more of this later once my water is dry, but I do like to start off smooth and then kind of work into the rough. All right. I'm now going to go ahead and work on my mountain top. I've mixed some ultramarine blue and some burnt umber for my color. Mountains tend to look kind of bluish, especially if they're way off in the distance. So I'm just kind of pointing at the top of my mountain and kind of pulling some color down. And again, with just like the water, I'm going to start off with just kind of some nice smooth color, and then I can always go in and build up my other colors later. At this point, I'm kind of looking for areas that are light and dark, warm and cool, and just trying to keep it kind of light and interesting. I might leave a little bit of white kind of poking through at places for maybe some distant snow or some distant rock that's catching the light just a little bit more. And I'm just kind of working into the mountains, kind of some nice color here throughout. So I'm getting those nice and filled with this, it's almost like this blue grayish color. And I like using this mixture, blue and brown, because you can control how cool or warm the color is. So I usually use a cooler blue, right, to cool it down if I want it to be cooler, and then I'll add a little bit more brown to warm it up if I want it to be a little warmer. So it's just such a wonderful way to kind of go back and forth between those temperatures depending on what I'm painting. Now I am leaving some space at the bottom of these mountains for some distant trees. So I'm not going all the way down to my water line. I'm going to have some pine trees down at the base. And then while this is still wet, I'm going to work in a couple of the darks of the mountains just by adding a little bit more pigment into the area with the tip of my brush. And kind of working it in. Some of the areas are more in shadow, they're a little darker, so just by adding a little more color, I get those soft edges again, which is kind of what I'm looking for in the distance. I'm trying to mix kind of a warmer color now, so I'm using some yellow ochre, some burnt umber, and adding a little more water, and I want to kind of warm up these rocks here in the foreground. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this light warm color on the top part of my rocks while I'm thinking rocks, and I'm putting those in. It's important to wait till your water is dry before you do this, otherwise this color will just bleed right into that water area surrounding the rocks. At this point too, you can kind of play around with how dark or light you want them to be I'm also going to add a little line of sand, dirt along the bottom of my little island here, just by kind of adding a horizontal line just above where the water is. You can use yellow ochre to warm it up a little bit more, kind of putting that out there right next to the water line. All right, next I am hoping to add some greenery, and I'm gonna pull some green. This is like an olive green that I have, a couple different, or maybe sap green, I'm not even sure what it is, but it's definitely a warmer green, and I'm gonna start kind of indicating some of these distant trees. Notice I just have my paintbrush pointed straight up, and I kind of jiggle it up and down a little bit to give this kind of tree line that is going right up against my mountains here, and it'll stop when it hits this island area. And then I can kind of fill that in with some more green as it gets farther down. Usually when you have these trees off in the distance, they're lighter on the top, and then they have a little bit more of a shadow or dark towards the bottom. So as I get towards the bottom of this tree section, I do want it to be a little bit more shadow or more dark. I will probably even add a little bit of blue in this as well, because like I said, things in a distance tend to have this bluish hue. It's called atmospheric perspective, which means things far away tend to have more blue. There's more atmosphere in between your eye and what you are seeing, and so this blue kind of ends up getting in the way and making things a little bit bluer the farther away they are from you. So I'm adding some blue to these trees to give them that depth and make them look a little bit farther away. And I'm adding a little bit more of a darker value along the water line just to kind of add to that shadow. And I'm adjusting my water line as I accidentally went a little low on my trees in one spot, so you can kind of move it as you need to. And then I'm just kind of filling it in here at the bottom. So it's kind of a nice transition from dark to light. I might even lighten the center part a little bit to give it a little bit more of a highlight here, a little bit more of a variety. I'm just drying off my brush and then pulling up some paint with a dry brush to kind of add a little bit of highlight there in those trees. Next, I want to start adding some trees on my island, and I'm going to start with this little bushy area in the front corner, and then I'm going to work my way into the actual tall like pine trees. So I'm starting off with maybe some of my lighter trees that are in the front, and I'm not going to get too fancy with these tree shapes. Again, because this island is kind of off in the distance, it does not need to be overly detailed. I'm just going to kind of indicate tree-like shapes, but I don't have to sit there and paint every little branch. It's better just to kind of think big shapes and values, and then you can kind of throw in some extra color here and there as needed, but to not get too fussy on all of the little details. So you can see this is basically like a big triangle, and that has kind of a bumpy edge. So I want to do that kind of throughout this little island, make a bunch of bumpy triangles and use kind of a variety of greens. You can always mix a little blue or purple in. You can mix some yellow in just to give it kind of a more painterly vibe. Usually trees have lots of different colors in them if you look carefully, and so just kind of indicating that in ways can make it more lively. So I threw a little bit of purple in, I'm adding a little bit of blue. It also creates some depth to the trees so they're not all just one color, one value. And I am pulling this tree kind of all the way down to my sandy ground here. As I'm painting these trees in, I don't want them all to be perfectly spaced out or all the same size or shape. So I'm making sure to pay attention to how tall they are, how thin or thick they are. Notice these 3 trees that I started with are all different sizes and thicknesses, which is good to have that variety. I'm going to paint this one super close to my other one to have a difference in spacing as well, so it doesn't look like someone just planted like a perfect row of trees, but that they're actually just kind of growing in the wild. And you know, a lot of times you've got really dense forest and sometimes it's more sparse and spread out. So you can decide kind of what kind of forest you would like to see on your little island here. I'm just kind of planting a couple different trees and trying to vary the size and shape of them. I'm going to go ahead and also vary how dark and light they are. So I'm trying to put maybe a darker one next to a lighter one to make the lighter one come forward, and so that there's just variety in that value too. So just kind of playing around, making these bumpy triangles to hopefully look believable as a little island of pine trees near my mountain lake. I'm continuing to bring these down, trying not to leave much space in between them. I'm really trying to kind of fill this space nicely with these trees. It's okay if they are so close that they're running into each other. It's not really a big deal. I'm just trying to kind of fill the space now with these trees. Just kind of tap, tap, tap in my brush to make it look like some tree foliage here, and to kind of fill in these open areas. I think this one I'm going to have stop a little higher to make the tree look a little bit farther back than the two lighter ones in the foreground. Here I'm just going to add a little bit of color to kind of fill in this empty space that I have left. And way over on the left side, I need to do that as well. So maybe I'll do a darker tree right here, and that'll kind of help it stand in front of those distant trees under my mountain. All right, I am liking that so far. Getting a little bit more excitement. At this point, I want to kind of darken some of my water, so I'm just going back in and adding a little bit more of the reflections. Now that I've got my trees in there, I kind of know what they look like. I can kind of throw in a little bit more green and blues into the water. I could also go into my mountains now that those have dried, and I'm gonna start darkening, adding a little bit more detail up into my mountains. So at this point, I'm just kind of walking around my painting thinking, okay, where can I add a little bit more value? Where can I add a little bit more interest? Which part doesn't look quite done? And I'm kind of going around and painting these different areas, trying to keep some of the lights still visible, so I'm not painting over all of the lights areas that I worked on, but trying to start incorporating a little bit of a darker value so that it adds a little bit more depth to my painting. So I'm doing that in the mountains. I did that some in the trees. I'll do that some in the water, just kind of tweaking and adjusting things as I go around my painting. I'm trying to remember though that the things that are farther off in the distance should have less of a value change and less detail than the things that are closer to me. So I don't want to get overly crazy detailed on these mountains or on the distant trees because they're so far away we wouldn't see all of those little details anyway. So trying to keep it simple and yet still have enough of a value change that it helps with the form of the mountains. I'm just using my blue-brown mixture again and just kind of looking for areas that could use a little bit more shadow, a little bit more shading way up into those mountains. Keeping it cool because they are far away, remembering that atmospheric perspective, just trying to keep those nice and painterly. I'm also looking for areas that I want to darken to kind of increase the value change closer to me. So I thought maybe by adding a little bit more of a shadow around these rocks, it'll make the rocks pop out and come forward, because right now the value is so similar to the water that they're kind of getting lost. So if I darken right above these rocks, then they'll kind of come forward a little bit more and stand out from the water. And then by adding some extra value down in here in the water, that will give that a little bit more importance too and bring it closer to the foreground. So I'm adding a little bit more blue, a little bit more darks, a little bit more shading down here in the corner and the front of my painting. And then it kind of just helps the viewer's eye be guided up into the back of the painting. You can see it has this kind of nice little S curve that draws your eye from the bottom right corner and then up to the left and then curves back to the right and then up to the mountain top. So it's really a nice composition to kind of keep in mind as I am painting this. I really want to darken the shadow here on the rocks and kind of separate it from the water. So I'm going back in with a darker blue-brown mixture. This one is more paint and less water. I just wanted to kind of darken some of these elements a little bit more to kind of give them a little bit more strength as they are down here in the corner. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then we'll kind of add some finishing touches here and there before I call this painting a masterpiece. So a lot of fun just kind of playing with the different elements here in this painting. So I'm going to add some finishing touch-ups to the water, rocks, things like that, and we'll call this painting complete. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed painting with me. If you have enjoyed this experience, please make sure to head to my channel, Ehlke Art, for more fun art tutorials. Thanks for watching and hope to see you again soon.